The book of Daniel divides quite neatly into two halves, and so we're on chapter 7 today, which is the first part or the first chapter of the second half of the book. I just want to recap a little bit, giving an overview of the book of Daniel, which will also give us some background into what's in the second half. The book of Daniel actually spans about 70 years. So obviously when we meet Daniel, first of all, when he's taken off captive into Babylon, he's obviously young, he's a teenager. And by the time we get to the end of the book, so when he's put into the lion's den, and also when he is seeing his final visions, he is quite an old man. He's in his 80s. The first 6 chapters that we've looked at deal mainly with history, and it's history of part of the Babylonian Empire, and it's God's involvement through Daniel with the Babylonians, particularly Babylonian rulers, and almost exclusively with Nebuchadnezzar, as God is using Daniel to speak to Nebuchadnezzar, to draw Nebuchadnezzar to himself, and we've seen that. In the second part of the book, we find that we have a series of prophecies, visions, a prayer, which God gives to Daniel, not so much for the Babylonians, but for God's people, for the Israelites, and for us. What we've decided to do is, on the second part of the book of Daniel, is we're going to do 4 Sunday morning messages. So I'm doing this one this morning, which looks mainly at Daniel 7, but it's an introduction, it's an overview of this part of the book. And then later on, we will intersperse them with our new series on Peter. Later on, there'll be one on spiritual warfare as seen in this part of the book of Daniel, one on Daniel's prayer in chapter 9, and also one on the latter part of the book, looking at end times. But we also felt that it might be, some people might like to look in a bit more detail at some of these prophecies and at the history at that time and following on, leading up to the birth of Jesus. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put on a couple of midweek Bible studies in June as well, just to look in a bit more detail in a way which perhaps isn't appropriate for a message on a Sunday morning. So look out for those if you're interested. So what I want to do this morning is to look over the general view over this part of the book, but I also want to go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which he had in Daniel chapter 2. And just if you remember there, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. He wanted it interpreting, but to make sure that people weren't just making it up to please him, he wouldn't tell them what the dream was. And his own wise men couldn't do that, but Daniel was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was, and then what the interpretation was of that dream. And so in that way we can see God speaking through Daniel as well, just as he does through these prophecies and so on in the second part of the book. So I'd like to tie that in as well. Nebuchadnezzar reigned was the ruler of the Babylonian Empire for about 43 years. Which is, even by today's standards, an appreciable time. I mean, I know the Queen's managed longer than that, but even in those days, that was a long time. One of the first things that he did was take some of the Israelites captive into Babylon, and one of those was Daniel. But eventually, of course, Nebuchadnezzar died. And his son took over the throne. His name was Evil Merodach. Okay? That doesn't necessarily mean he was evil, although he probably was. So that just happened to be his name. But after 2 years, he was assassinated by his brother-in-law, who was called Nereglissar. I have no idea if I am pronouncing these correctly, but neither have you, so that's fine. Nereglissar only reigned for 4 years. He died. He was succeeded by his son, Labashi Marduk. And he was only a child. So although he was the rightful king, it was the nobles of the country who were in charge. But within a few months, he was killed. And he was killed by somebody called Nabonidus. Yeah, Nabonidus, who was probably one of the nobles. He certainly wasn't a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, so he wasn't somebody from the royal line. And he conspired to have this child king killed, and he took over the throne. But on taking over the throne, what he then did, for some reason, was he went off to live in a far outpost of the Babylonian Empire and left his son in charge as king. And his son was Belshazzar. And he was the last king, or it turns out that he was the last ruler of the Babylonian Empire. Now, none of that is in the book of Daniel. That comes from the Chronicles of Babylon, because, you know, as they did in Israel, in many places, they wrote, you know, there was somebody within the court who wrote down the things that happened, usually with a bit of spin on it to make them look good. But I think that that background is important, because what we need to remember is that Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Daniel to a position of authority within the Babylonian Empire. And for about 40 years, there was relative stability because Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler. And then all of a sudden, there's all this chaos, with murders and assassinations, and somebody becoming king who hadn't really got the right to be king, and then leaving his son in charge, and so on. And when we look at Daniel chapter 7, we find that this first dream that God gives to Daniel was in the first year that Belshazzar was king. So in the midst of all this chaos that was going on in the earth, and again, we don't know how Daniel felt about this. Perhaps we can try and imagine it, but it must have seemed a very uncertain time to him. And in the midst of all this, God speaks to him through this vision, through this dream. So I just want to read Daniel chapter 7. The first part is the dream, and then the second part is the interpretation of the dream, which is also part of the dream. So in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it." What on earth is that about? Yeah? I think one thing that's important to remember here is that Daniel is trying to put into words something that he has seen, which is completely out of his experience and out of human experience. So it doesn't say it was a lion, he said it was like a lion. Because that's the best he can do within the words. Because it obviously wasn't a lion, because it had wings of an eagle as well. And we just need to remember that when we're looking at this. That this is Daniel's attempt to put into words something that he is seeing, which is incredible. So carrying on from verse 5, and there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I'm not surprised. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot what was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favour of the saints of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my first face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So as I said, it just seems to me relevant that it was at this time when there was all this turmoil going on earth in terms of what was happening within the Babylonian Empire that God gives this vision to Daniel. And what I want us just to think about this morning is what did this vision mean to Daniel, apart from the fact that it frightened him so much? What did it mean to the Israelites in captivity in Babylon and afterwards? And what does it mean to us today? Why is it there for us to read? And I believe the reasons are linked, so I'm not going to deal necessarily with them separately in that way. There's been much debate, if you read what different people have written, about the meaning, not the meaning of the four beasts, that the four beasts are four kingdoms, but what are those four kingdoms? And some will say they're the same as the four kingdoms that are seen in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Some will say they are kingdoms that we see on the earth now. But obviously this is now, and 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, people would have been saying, well, I think it's these four kingdoms. I don't want to dwell on this, but maybe we might look at it a bit more in one of the Bible studies. But if you look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, verse 36, I'll just deal with this quickly so you don't need to look it up. But if you remember, he saw this statue with a head of gold. And in the interpretation of the dream, God says to Nebuchadnezzar, through Daniel, you are that head of gold. So it makes clear which those kingdoms are. In Daniel chapter 8, and I know we've not looked at it yet, but we have here Daniel's vision of a ram and a goat. And God says to Daniel, the two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. So again, it is specific as to which those kingdoms are. If we look in Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 11, the vision that Daniel has here was in the first year of Darius the Mede. So now the Persians and the Medes have taken over from Babylon. So it's his first year. And God says this, now then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Persia and then a 4th. So for all of those, God makes clear in the interpretation which kingdoms they are. But he doesn't do that in Daniel chapter 7. And so we can spend a lot of time debating what are those 4 kingdoms. But 2 things I would say. First of all, we must be very careful not to add anything to the Word of God that isn't there. And secondly, we can spend so much time debating what are the 4 kingdoms that we miss the whole point of the vision. And so what I want to do is to take a general view. And I just want us to think about what is God saying through this. What was he saying to Daniel? What is he saying to the Israelites at that time and shortly afterwards? What is he saying to us? The first thing I want to say is, the thing that it says to me is that there is a glorious future for God's children. At Preaching Club, when we first looked at this, I asked the question, what do you think is the main message of Daniel chapter 7? And somebody said, we win. And I think as we look at it, and everything else within it, that's what we need to remember. That in Christ, we win. Now you've got to remember that when Daniel had this vision, he had no idea that God would send his son Jesus to die on the cross, to take away our sins, to rise again from the dead, and to give us that victory. But he knew God was going to do something because God showed it to him in this vision. And so the message there is that we win in Christ. Secondly, and again, think about this in the context in which Daniel was receiving this vision, in which the Israelites were living in Babylon in all this chaos. God is saying earthly kingdoms don't last. He's saying there's a kingdom, and then there's another kingdom, then there's another one. And of course this was Daniel's experience, wasn't it? Because he knew that before the Babylonians there were the Assyrians. And so God is saying, yes, there's all this chaos in the Babylonian Empire, but don't worry, because it's not going to last. There'll be another one after it, and then another one. And so, and of course, us with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back through history and we can say, yes, that's what we've seen. So I think that for Daniel, with God giving him that vision, yes, although Daniel was terrified by the things that he saw in that dream, that there was comfort for him in knowing that this wasn't it. There was comfort in it for the Israelites, not just then, but in the years ahead. Again, we're not going to look in detail at Daniel chapter 11. We may well do that on one of the Bible studies, but if we look at Daniel chapter 11, much of it covers this period of history that we don't have in the Bible. The period is within the 400 years between the end of what's written in the Old Testament and the birth of Jesus. And much of it covers it in incredible detail. In fact, so much that some people refuse to believe that the book of Daniel was written before those events took place, because they deny the power of God to do that. What about for us? Well, we can look back and we can say, well, lots of prophecies in the book of Daniel have already been fulfilled, and have been fulfilled just as God said they would be, but not all of them. There are still some to come. But we can draw assurance, not just from our faith in God, but from the experience that people have had of those fulfillment of those prophecies that God has said he will do. And that nothing can prevent that. Earthly kingdoms don't last. The next thing that I get out of this, and again I think this is for Daniel, this is for the Israelites, and this is for us, is that God's people will be persecuted for their faith. In verse 8, Daniel chapter 7 verse 8, while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. And then later on in verse 23, where he gives an explanation about this, he gave me this explanation: the fourth beast is the fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. And then he goes on to say, verse 25, he will speak against the Most High, oppress his saints, and try to change the set times and the laws. And so it is saying in there, in this vision, God is saying to Daniel, my people will be persecuted for their faith. And again, we know that through history. We know that in the present day there are parts of the world where Christians are being imprisoned and tortured and put to death because of their faith. Between 400 and 500 years ago, in this country, people were burned at the stake because they believed in and preached about the same things that we believe in and preach about. And some of that was not that far away from here. And people like Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer, somebody you might not have heard of, Thomas Bilney over at Norwich. If you look up the story of Thomas Bilney on Wikipedia, it's fascinating. I like him because he really struggled with it. He kept saying, no, I'll change my mind, I won't preach it anymore if you don't. But in the end he couldn't. It reminded me of Jeremiah where he said, your word's inside me and I can't stop preaching it. And because of that, he was burned at the stake. And many others. God shows Daniel that his people will be persecuted for their faith. And there was a time it was about 150, 160 years before Jesus was born. There was a time, it talks in Daniel chapter 11 about the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and how there was this, Israel was, if you like, was trapped in the middle. But at one time there was a ruler who came along who was a ruler of the northern kingdom, Syria at the time, and who mercilessly persecuted the Jews. And yes, it's hard to say there's comfort in here, but there is, because God is saying, yes, I know. But he isn't just saying, I know. He's also saying, despite what you see, despite how it may feel, in spite of what might be going on around about you, I am still in charge. In verse 25, Daniel chapter 7, it says this about this oppression and this persecution. It says, the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. What did God say there? He said, I'm in control. There will be an end to it. When Jesus talked about it to his disciples and talked about things that would happen in the end time, he said, these times will be cut short for the sake of the saints. There will be an end to it. I can't remember where I read this or where I heard this, but somebody said if life's hard, if it's difficult, if it's a struggle, it's not the end. You haven't got to the end yet. So, in this vision that Daniel has of this persecution of God's people, is that what we are seeing already? Is that what we've been seeing down through the years? Or is this still to come? And we have to be very careful, don't we? Because I've already said we mustn't put things into the Bible that aren't there. But I would just say this. It talks about the fourth kingdom appearing on earth, being different from the other kingdoms and devouring the whole earth. And therefore I would suggest that if we take that literally, that's not what we have yet seen. There are, of course, parallels to this in the book of Revelation. And don't worry, I'm not going to do a study of the whole book of Revelation. But just in Revelation chapter 13, verse 5, I just want to read a few verses from there. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. And some people would say that in Daniel it says a time, times, and half a time, which is a year, 2 years, and half a year, which is 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. And so we see a parallel there in what John saw in his vision on the island of Patmos. But again, you see, that isn't the end, because as we look further through in Revelation, it talks about resurrection. he talks about resurrection. And there's a particular mention of those who have died for their faith in the resurrection. Because you see, even if we are put to death because of our faith, it is not the end. Something that struck me when I was looking at Daniel chapter 7 yesterday, and that is this fourth kingdom is introduced. Verse 8. While I was thinking about the horns, there came up, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and three of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and that a mouth that spoke boastfully. And this is God showing Daniel what is happening on earth. But then immediately, he gives Daniel a picture of what is happening in heaven. So, on the earth, we have got this horn coming up, which is going to persecute the saints, which is going to be opposed to God's kingdom. But in heaven, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. So even in that persecution that's going on the earth, in heaven, God is ruling, God is reigning, God is preparing for what he is going to do with his people to bring them to glory. And the final thing that I want to mention here, that God shows Daniel in this vision, which I believe is relevant to him and to Israelites and to us, is the contrast between God's kingdom and earthly kingdoms. He's showing, isn't he, that earthly kingdoms come and go. Yes, under God's authority, God raises them up and God takes them down. But there is coming God's kingdom, which is an everlasting kingdom. And I like the way it emphasises it in verse 18. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. And then just in case you haven't got it, it says, yes, forever and ever. God's kingdom is superior to all others that have ever been. Verse 27, then the sovereignty, power and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints. Who are the saints? We are the saints. The people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. So just in summary, what is God saying to us this morning in this? I believe it's these things. First of all, he knows. Whatever you might be going through at the moment, if you've got difficulties, if you've got hardships, if you've got struggles, if you've got uncertainty in your life, and that, by the way, is normal, he knows. Secondly, he's in charge. Whatever might be going on around about you. And he calls us to trust in him and to walk with him. And it says in various places, particularly in the New Testament, that as we trust him and walk with him in those times of difficulty, that he will use those to transform us, to change us, to make us more like Jesus. You know, in one of the Psalms, David, and I just get the impression here that David was despondent. Probably because there were people out to get him, because for a lot of his life there were people out to get him. And he got his head down. And he said, I lift my eyes to the hills. He lifted his head up. And then he says, where does my strength come from? Not the hills, my strength comes from God. And he was able to look from the situation to the source of his strength, his God. And finally, what does it say to us? It says that we have a glorious future. That we win. We already have the victory because Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead to give us the victory. This is what John says, and I'll finish with this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away. And this order of things that we see that is so temporary, that is so unstable, that is so changing, will pass away. And there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And I may have mentioned this before, but it says he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And that means to me, well, that must mean there will be tears to wipe away. Because life is difficult. It's hard. There are struggles. There are situations. But God is with us in all of them. He knows all about them. And he promises us this glorious future. Amen.